Biden's economy is booming, at least on paper, where the numbers show that its economy has been growing quite a bit faster than comparable economies like Europe, the United Kingdom and Japan. On top of that, unemployment is still extremely low and inflation is now falling faster than ever. And yet, recent surveys reveal that Americans are very negative about their economy and especially the way that President Joe Biden handled it compared to President Donald Trump. So, how is it possible that a seemingly booming economy could cost Joe Biden the election? Are people just imagining things, or is the economy really not as good as it seems on paper? To answer these questions, I have been scouring the internet for convincing explanations from economists, and I've actually found 3 fascinating theories that could explain the difference between what the numbers say and how voters feel about the economy. Theories that range from increased inequality to increased media negativity to Republican states like Texas and Florida outperforming Democratic ones like California and New York. Theories that all have some pretty convincing evidence to back them up. But which theory has the most convincing evidence? Well, to answer that question, let's first review the key numbers which suggest that Biden's economy is booming. Specifically, we'll have a look at the 4 most commonly used indicators to reflect how well average Americans are doing economically speaking. Real GDP, which is GDP corrected for inflation, inflation itself, unemployment, and the average real wage, which is the average wage, again, corrected for inflation. First, as you can see here, America's real GDP per person indeed looks relatively good when compared to other economies such as Europe, the United Kingdom, and Japan. Everyone was hit hard by the COVID pandemic lockdowns, but only America's economy recovered to the pre-COVID trend line, potentially due to the generous economic stimulus provided first by Trump and then by Biden. Stimulus that likely gave businesses the confidence to quickly rehire everyone that lost their job when the pandemic began, meaning that after a big spike, unemployment is again at an all-time low. However, there was also a dark side to this recovery: unprecedented inflation, making life much more expensive for ordinary Americans. Sure, many of these price increases were caused by pandemic-related supply chain disruptions and later the war in Ukraine. However, most economists agree that without generous stimulus measures, the massive inflation spike that you see here would likely not have happened, or at least reversed more quickly afterwards. And while the GDP numbers still look good when corrected for inflation, the same can really not be said for real average wages, which, as you can see here, have only recently returned to their pre-pandemic trend as inflation is now falling. But okay, before we get into this drop of real wages here, we need to talk about something strange. You see, this bump over here, it means average real wages went up at the start of the pandemic. But why? Well, we can actually see this bump because at the start of the pandemic, many vulnerable people lost their jobs. And with a lot of vulnerable people who don't earn that much out of a job, the average wage actually went up because it only reflected the wage of these high-income earners. But then, as the more vulnerable people were hired back quite quickly, the average real wage dropped again. So yeah, this bump at the start of the pandemic is pretty meaningless for judging how well the economy was doing at the time. And for now, I think it's best to just ignore it and just focus on this drop over here, which makes clear that, when everybody was hired back, most working Americans saw the spending power of their wages drop during Biden's tenure because their wage growth, which did grow, did not keep up with inflation. So if we look at the metrics, we can see that America's economy definitely took a big hit from the pandemic. First, GDP dropped massively while unemployment rose, But then as stimulus kicked in, GDP and unemployment recovered. However, then inflation spiked so much that actually for a long time the average wage corrected for inflation fell and it only recently recovered. And while that looks bad, it can always be worse as real wages continued to fall in 2023 for Europe, the United Kingdom and Japan. So then why are Americans just as negative as, for example, Europeans about the state of their economy? Well, while there are many explanations circulating online, I only found 3 that could be supported by at least somewhat convincing evidence. Of these, Biden's favorite explanation is that you are being misinformed by the media. But before getting into that, let's talk about data brokers informing scammers, spammers and hackers about you and how today's video sponsor Aura can help you do something about that. You see, if you just simply Google yourself, you will be surprised by some of the weird websites that claim to know intimate stuff about you, ranging from your phone number, your health records, to your relatives, to your personality type. This is why I've been using Aura, the sponsor of today's video, which showed me all the data brokers that used my information and then automatically submitted the requests that are needed to opt out from them. This helps me reduce spam and protects my social media and bank accounts from hackers. What I really like about Aura in particular is that it offers me multiple layers of protection, such as antivirus, VPN, password management, parental control, identity theft insurance and more, all at one affordable price. Of course, you may already have 1 or 2 of these tools. However, not having Aura is like locking the front door and leaving the back door wide open. Aura is always on, doing the hard work of keeping me safe so that I can focus on economic research with peace of mind. If you're interested in trying it out, consider going to aura.com/moneyandmacro or by clicking on the link in the description below to start your 2-week trial. After, of course, hearing about why Biden feels that you are being misinformed by the media. Which is quite refreshing, right? This time it's not Trump that is lashing out at the media, it is Biden who said that the media is not properly reporting about the state of the economy. And let's be honest, it is true that especially on social media, like here on YouTube for example, videos about the collapse of the American economy were trending in 2023, even as the economy recovered from a global pandemic shutdown. Therefore, some started to say that 2023 was not the year of an economic recession, but rather the year of a vibe session in which just the vibes were really bad. But why were the vibes in the media so bad? Well, here many have pointed out that the cause could be something called negativity bias, which means that when given the choice, people tend to watch negative news stories more often than positive ones. But are Americans more exposed to negative news than, for example, Europeans? Well, yes, that is likely for 2 reasons. The first is that Americans, on average, rely more on social media for their news, which is extremely competitive, and therefore creators are more likely to exploit your negativity bias to get views. The second reason is that even if you just look at traditional media, Americans are more likely to be confronted with sensationalized negative news as their media landscape is much more commercialized. But is this really why people were so negative about Biden's booming economy? Well, recent research by economists does show that media sentiment about the economy has gotten significantly worse over the past 50 years, even as the economy kept growing. However, as you can see from the red line over here, when Trump was president, economic news also got way more negative. But at the same time, the economic sentiment measured in an influential survey by the University of Michigan, which is the blue line, well, this remained much more positive. So I don't think negative news stories can fully explain the vibe session under Biden, which brings us to the second theory, which states that it's not only that the US media is exceptionally competitive and therefore negative, it is also uniquely polarized politically. And strangely enough, the University of Michigan survey shows that the implications of this political polarization are very important for how people feel about the economy. For example, as you can see here, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, Republicans were suddenly really optimistic about the economy, while Democrats all of a sudden thought that the economy was in terrible shape. Similarly, when Biden was elected in 2020, Republicans all of a sudden thought that the economy was going down the drain, while Democrats thought that it was doing great. Of course, that fact alone cannot explain why Biden's economy is so much more unpopular than that of Trump. After all, given that both parties are roughly equally popular, on average, how people feel about the economy would not change that much if there is a new president. Sure, under Biden, Republicans hate the economy, but that was always going to happen. However, surprisingly, Democrats are also relatively pessimistic about the economy right now. That is Biden's real problem. But why are Democrats so negative about Biden's booming economy? Could it be that for them it is not really booming that much? Well, if you look at America's economy state by state and then hold that next to a map of voting patterns, you can see that it's actually mostly the red state economies that are darker on the economic growth map, meaning that they are the ones who have been booming. But why are red Republican states doing so much better than blue Democratic states? Well, one plausible explanation that has been put forward by economist Noah Smith is that highly restrictive zoning regulations are making it all but impossible to build new houses and factories in blue states. This is contributing to unaffordable housing, which then leads to increased homelessness and migration from blue states to red states. Ironically, it also means that Biden's massive subsidies for new factories are mostly benefiting red states. Now, this could explain why Democrats are relatively negative about the economy, which in turn could explain why on average people are also relatively negative about the economy. After all, citizens of booming Republican states will be negative about the economy because Biden is president. So there it matters less that their economies are doing relatively well. Meanwhile, blue state citizens are still more positive than those in red states, but they are not super positive because their economies are actually not doing that well. If this is true, it means that political polarization is causing Mr. Biden's economy to be underappreciated rather than media negativity. But what if both of these theories about an underappreciated economy are wrong? What if regular Americans are actually right and actually the numbers are wrong thanks to rising inequality? Something that can essentially already be seen if we look back at the differences between real GDP, the average income, and the average real wages of American workers. As you can see here, well, real GDP dropped during the pandemic, it then recovered quite quickly. However, here we can see that real wages have really only now just recovered to their pre-pandemic trend. Essentially, that means that average working people have felt the impact of rising prices more than they have seen their wages increase, at least up till now. So from their perspective, they were genuinely experiencing a recession. And so they were right to feel more pessimistic about the economy, really until now. And indeed, it's only now that we see that people are getting more optimistic about the economy. Some more evidence for this theory can actually be seen if we look at income inequality in the United States. Here we can see that while it got a lot better in 2020 and 2021, mostly thanks to Biden's stimulus checks, inequality then once again got way worse in 2022 as the stimulus measures ended. Similarly, if we look at the supplemental poverty rate, which takes into account the rising costs of living due to inflation, we can see that it is now also higher than it was when Biden took office, even though, like general inequality, it had dipped significantly thanks to Biden's relief funds during COVID. So while average GDP growth looks pretty good, lagging real wages and increased inequality suggests that it is plausible that up to now, only a few Americans really profited from this booming economy, and therefore it makes total sense that most Americans were as pessimistic as their European counterparts. On the other hand, if we look at the surveys, we can see that while those that filled them out were relatively negative about the economy, they were actually quite positive about their own financial situation. Which is why the most logical conclusion is that all of these factors play a role, although not equally so. Most importantly, I think we need to recognize that inflation genuinely made it so that most people experienced a recession. Something that can be seen if we look at real wages, but cannot be seen if we only look at GDP. Second, I think the fact that voters feel so different about the economy if their favorite president is in charge is so big that it could really mess with the reliability of the overall survey. And so the fact that red states outperformed blue states by a lot and benefited from Bidenomics more could really have impacted overall economic sentiment. Third, while I did think that it was interesting to see that research confirms that the media is getting more and more negative, despite the economy not getting more and more negative, it is part of a larger trend that is not unique to Biden. So overall, I think that it made sense that people were more pessimistic than the headline GDP numbers suggested. But luckily for Biden, inflation is now coming down rapidly and real wages are recovering. And lo and behold, people are now once again becoming more optimistic about the economy. But whether or not that effect will be big enough to swing the election in Biden's favor, well, we'll just have to see. In the meantime, I just want to thank my patrons and members for giving me the financial stability to avoid having to tap into your negativity bias too much here on YouTube. And yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought about this take. Were these the 3 most important reasons for the difference between pessimistic economic sentiments and positive data about the economy? Or do you think I missed another credible explanation? Finally, if you want to know more about why exactly inflation is falling so fast now, check out this video over here.